Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second in a series of policy seminars on rising food and fertilizer prices following the invasion of Ukraine. The first one was held on the 9th of March, and it focused on global agricultural commodity prices. Today, we look at how those global prices get transmitted to the national level and impact retail prices. We are very eager to hear from you throughout this seminar. Please submit your questions or comments on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. It's now my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Jo Swinnen, who is the Global Director of Systems Transformation within CGIAR, and also the Director General of IFPRI. Thanks for being with us today, Jo.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks very much, Charlotte. It's a great pleasure to be here, although the topic itself is not exactly something to be pleased about. I don't think the topic needs much of an introduction in the sense that everybody knows this is a really important issue which is affecting so many people around the world today. I think we have a fantastic panel here today. I'm extremely pleased that His Excellency Minister of State Ngabe Sinze is with us today, Minister of Rwanda. Then my colleague Ali Abu Saba is also here. Ali is the DG of ICARDA and currently also he's also having two hats in the CDR system, just like me, the regional director for Central and West Asia and North Africa. And we, of course, we have our colleague Galbore from the World Bank and several of our colleagues from IFPRI today, Rob, Valeria, Bart, and Sikandra, who are all will make, I think, very interesting and important contributions. Let me give a brief introduction of the issue as well. I have put together a few slides on that. This is, next slide, please. So this figure, I think many of you who are with us today have seen this already, right? And so what's important here is that, you know, in 2007, 2008, we saw this food price spike as an exception to a fairly stable norm. I think if we look back now, so this is the last 22 years, now we see that spikes are actually the norm and stability is the exception. So we are living in this world which is very different from the period, I think, before 2005. You also see the correlation between the food, the fuel, and the fertilizer prices, which is rather common again across this period, and so the high price spikes, where today we are at the same level of even beyond the spikes in 2007, 2008. There are a number of reasons why the spike or problem or the cause of the high food price may be worse or a bigger challenge today than it was in the previous one, and that's a number of reasons. One is that, of course, COVID-19 had a big impact on the poor people in the world, and so many are still recovering, both, I think, economically and socially from this impact, and so this comes on top of that. We know that since 2015, structurally, hunger and malnutrition are on the rise again. We also know from the government perspective that while during COVID-19 there's been an expansion of social programs, but also there's been an expansion of public expenditures, okay? And so again, this comes on top of that. And it is, of course, unclear at this point how long the current challenges will persist. Next slide, please. So the next slide kind of summarizes briefly that before the wars which started in Ukraine, that the prices were already high and stocks were actually lower than in 2008, except for rice. So in terms of the stocks of corn, soybeans, and wheat, you can see that on the right-hand panel, there you see the lines are going down. So these are the blue lines and the green lines over the past couple of years. And only the red line, which is the line of rice, is going up. And so that's certainly a factor of concern. The evolution of the prices it's in more detail there, what was already in the previous slide, but you know that prices have gone up prior to the war. Next slide. So the war has exacerbated all these things, and we know that in terms of calorie supply to the world, Russia and Ukraine both produce or supply roughly 6% of calories of the world. So that's a lot. But of course, it's concentrated in a few commodities, and it's more concentrated, the impact in terms of who depends on that supply in a number of countries. And so if you look on the left-hand panel has information on the commodities, and there you see particular in wheat, barley, sunflower, and sunflower oil, the role of Russia and Ukraine together are really important. On the right-hand panel, this is a map of the world, and there you very clearly see it's the countries around Russia and Ukraine which are clearly more dependent on their supply. And so the area where Ali is working on or is responsible for supervising is clearly very heavily affected by this, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation on this. Next slide, please. On the, it's not just the food, okay? It's also the food production system itself, which will be very strongly affected both by the war itself, by the disruption of the supply channels there, the infrastructure, the export constraints, but also, and so this is also translated in, for example, the increased price in fertilizers and fuels. Also, these prices were on the rise, and clearly, it's not just Russia; it's also Belarus, which is facing sanctions, where the fertilizer exports are really significantly affected, and these are really important supply channels for the world. And again, it is geographically concentrated in a number of countries, and you see that several African countries are really very heavily dependent on this. Next slide. I think throughout, I'm not going to go into details here. I mean, the key point is there are policies that need to be looked at, taken care of, redesigned, but also sometimes not being introduced in terms of, think about trade restrictions, etc. So both at the regional level, at the global level, and at the country level. And I think today we'll hear a number of discussions on these things. I'm not going to go into that, but it's obviously extremely important. And then my last slide is about our own work, okay, how it's affected. I think there you know that, or you may not know that IFPRI has been extremely active on this already for a month now. We have a series of blogs, a series of events. And I think it's very important that we have the capacity to do this. And in order to have this capacity, we need to invest in this. And so this is a factor which is really important right now when we are thinking about the restructuring of IFPRI and the CGIAR system in terms of investments. So I focus here on the policy side of things, if you want, and I know Ali will talk about some of the other investments that are needed, more in terms of technology and management structure that are also undergoing in his organization and in the CGIAR as a whole. So with that, Charlotte, back to you. I don't hear you, Charlotte.
Her image seems to be frozen.
Okay, while we are waiting for Charlotte to reconnect, thank you very much, Yo, for that overview. We are now going to turn it over to Ali Abu Sabah, who wears two hats as the Regional Director of the Central and West Asia and North Africa for the CGIAR, and he's also the Director General for the International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Glad to be with all of you here today to discuss this, the topic of the hour. If I could have the slides, please. So, you offered us an excellent overview in, looking at the drivers of the problem and how the food prices are affecting, the whole world. And what I'm going to try and do is possibly to try and take a bit more focus on the Middle East and North Africa, maybe the whole of the Siwana region, and how this is affecting, the individual countries, and possibly from there go and share some of the innovations within the CG that could help countries adjust and adapt to this. And of course, the greatest challenge is that we do not know how long this crisis will prevail. So if you can move, next slide, please. Next slide, please. One more, please. Good. So I think, sorry, my apology, backwards. It's moving, the technology is moving a little bit fast. So I think, my apology, is the one with the vortex, please. Okay, so I think, what is most critical with this rising food prices is that this comes at a time when the region is already facing very, very serious challenges. The whole question of conflict, malnutrition, high population, increased land degradation, climate, water scarcity and climate change. And of course, these are basically constitute together what we like to characterize as a perfect storm. So when you have rising food prices, this automatically triggers a very, very unfavorable response from the people, and rightfully so. And of course, this also puts the whole question of rising food prices at the center of what the governments are trying to manage in the region. Next slide, please. So we have seen a very different and also very diverse way of response from the countries. We have seen countries looking forward to purchase more wheat and more food from other sources, like in Lebanon. But the challenge there is that there is insufficient storage capacity, especially after the unfortunate events that happened. So even though you may be able to source the wheat, you have serious challenges about finding the right infrastructure in place. There are also, many countries that are struggling with severe drought, like in the case of Morocco. Good rains, like in certain other parts, and possibly even a bumper crop this year. But what we are seeing to be really common among all the countries in the region is that they're looking for a more sustainable way of responding to the crisis, and that has been through the diversification. First of all, being able to generate more food. It may not necessarily be wheat in the forum, so looking at replacements and different sources for human food, but also something to feed the animals. So within this context, the 1CG has been looking at how to support these countries where the desert dominates a large part of these countries. So we came up with the concept of an integrated desert farming that looks at the existing CGIAR innovations, bringing the land together with the water, together with alternative sources of protein like fish, bringing the small ruminants, and how you would look at this as a collective package of innovations that can produce more food for the people, but also alternative ways for looking and generating more feed for the animals, so that you're able to compete less with the traditional sources of food, but at the same time, you're able to maintain and add value along the value chain. Next slide, please. So what this integrated desert farming seeks to do is to look at what are the available natural resources that can be exploited to be able to generate more food. So we've looked more broadly at the region. The region has abundance of solar energy. So that allows the use of clean energy to pump water out, and possibly through investments in modern irrigation systems, you're able to deal with the issue of water scarcity and be able to actually save significant amounts of water to grow crops. We've been looking at alternative sources of animal feed, such as cactus, that is really loved by the animal, the small ruminants that are typical to this part of the world. Feeding the camels with this kind of thing could potentially save up to 40% of the straw and alternative feed sources such as barley, which you can now start to divert to make bread as a substitute or as a key ingredient, mixing it with wheat flour, so that you're able to produce what people like to eat in this region, which is bread. We've been able to look at the more adapted species of small ruminants, those that are naturally adapted to the heat, that it consumes traditionally almost half the water that the traditional livestock would consume, and making this to be part of the system. We've been looking at non-traditional crops for the CG, but that are quite prominent in the region, such as date palm, looking more broadly, and other types of trees, such as fig trees, olive trees, and how you could bring in an entire system that would maximize the alternative sources of revenue and improvement of livelihood of the smallholders, but also allowing them opportunities to create value from a different value chain. So under extreme conditions, they are able to sustain themselves and take something to the markets that generate income and make the overall livelihood much better. So it's not a simple question. I think this is one area that needs to be developed further, and it requires a lot of exchange of knowledge across the globe. And I think this is one area where the one CGIAR is quite, good in doing. If we can move to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, so this slide shows actually the model through which this integrated concept could work with the research partners at the center of all of this. And you can see how neatly the different research capacities from across the CGIAR come in, but then the very important role that the small and medium enterprises and startups and companies will have to play in order to be able to provide the ingredients for this. And we've heard from, the whole question about the rising prices of inputs as well, of course, the fertilizer. It also has a very clear role for the farmers being at the center of this, all the donors, the NGOs, and many of the key partners. All of this needs to come together to be able to work with the NARS and the key, advanced partner institutions, so that collectively you're able to consolidate the knowledge, bring in the best practices from across the globe and take it to farmer fields, and then make sure that it is producing the expected results at country level. Next slide, please. So if this, works in the way it is being designed, and we'll definitely make sure that it succeeds, it has the potential to actually make a significant large amount of people to have improved livelihoods. It will put into good use the bundles of innovations that has been developed over the past 50 years, and it will help leverage a significant amount of technologies through opportunities for public and private producers to come together, leveraging the artificial intelligence, the remote sensing, all in a manner that needs to be accelerated so that we're able to move to the next level of improved livelihoods. Next slide, please. So I think, there is a significant crisis, but I think that it also offers enormous amount of opportunities. If we're able to think in a very different way and not see and be only focused on the crisis. I think there are sufficient knowledge and innovations out there that could help countries diversify their production system, that could help countries understand what are the variety of policy options that they need to be able to put in place, leverage in a very different way the social safety nets that have prevailed for many years, for them to be able to leverage this to have a more, probably a better future. It's going to definitely have a crunch on the short term, but on the medium, on the long term, there are definitely a number of policy options and technological innovations that can be leveraged to turn this situation in a different direction. So let me stop here and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ali, for reviewing the integrated desert farming approach that you've outlined. And it's terrific to see how the CGIAR is working with the countries in the region to implement this. I also appreciated your talking about finding alternative feed for animals so that there is not greater competition for the crops that humans tend to consume. And IFPRI has been raising a similar point about biofuels, that we should not be diverting food crops to the production of biofuels at this point in time. So thank you very much, Ali. We really appreciate your remarks. I'm now going to turn to Rob Voss, who's the Division Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at IFPRI, which has done really great work in tracking the food price movements already for the past year, but certainly now with more attention after the Ukraine crisis. So Rob, you're going to talk to us today to really talk about this very important topic, research topic. How do we understand to what extent global agricultural commodity prices get transmitted to the national level? Because of course it will depend on country to country. So very interesting presentation, and thank you very much for giving that today.
Thank you, Charlotte. And yes, I'll be happy to talk about the impact of the global, the ramification of the global markets volatility onto domestic food price inflation. But before getting into that, the first point I would like to raise is following up from what Ali was saying. We have to put this in broader perspective. If we think of imminent food crisis, we of course think of Ukraine, but we should also think of the situation in the Horn of Africa, where an imminent famine is there because of prolonged and repeated droughts. And that's not directly related to the ramifications of the invasion of Ukraine and its impacts on global markets. So it's good to put that into perspective. The second point I'd like to make, it's important to understand well how the international consequences are having an impact on domestic situations. And the managing director of the IMF said a few weeks ago that the war in Ukraine means hunger in Africa. Now, while that may be true, it's not a direct relationship. We need to understand well how that works, and through that also understand what would be the right policy responses. So if we go to the next slide, please. So first, it's good to see that food prices in international markets, but also to consumers around the world, were already up last year. So this is a heat map of consumer inflation as of February 22nd of this year, so just before the invasion in Ukraine. So already before that, we saw this map coloring red, and that was because also in international markets, as Jo's presentation showed, prices had already increased during last year, particularly because of the two-track recovery from the pandemic, the crisis caused by the pandemic, and particularly developing countries not being able to produce enough food to meet increasing demand with the recovery. But also has to do with other factors that has to do with exchange rates, fiscal space, and for food subsidies, for which a lot of the developing countries have less capacity to respond to. When we go to the next slide, it's very clear here from, if we take it a year ago, then the map on the left is much lighter colored than on the right, which means much higher food inflation rates. But also at the beginning of last year, inflation rates were already up in several parts of the world, in part because of this two-track recovery I just mentioned. So what we need to do is to dig a little deeper into the specific causes and transmission mechanisms of what's happening in global markets. So we go to the next slide, please. So here's a framework to think about that. So on the left-hand side, we see shocks in the markets that directly related to the conflict because of the importance of particularly Russia and Ukraine for the production and exports of core commodities. And those effects could be exacerbated because of high oil prices and supply restrictions in fertilizer markets, increased cost of inputs. And we're seeing already trade restrictions, be it in the form of sanctions or be it in the form of actual restrictions posed by countries that could further exacerbate food price shocks. And I'll emphasize a bit these trade restrictions that are very important to consider, not just because of export bans that producing countries and food exporting countries may impose, and that will insulate their own populations from increased prices, but will be bad for everybody else. On the other hand, what we've seen and we know from the crisis in 2008, 2009, and 2010, 2011, that many food importing countries then respond by lowering import tariffs on the food items to insulate their consumers, but that will drive up demand for food imports around the world if that happens on a large scale, and that then will further drive up food prices and exacerbating the shock we have. So we need to understand this dynamics well before we derive consequences for what it means for impacts at the country level. Then, of course, the vulnerabilities of countries will depend on how much they depend on imports of key staple foods, exchange rate, whether they have enough strengths, macroeconomic strengths to protect from further devaluations, particularly in food importing countries that could drive up the cost, the fiscal and other financial constraints that will determine to what extent countries are able to insulate their populations from the food price shocks, as well as, of course, the food production capacity inside the country and resilience to shocks like these, but also other shocks like weather shocks, as I mentioned in the beginning. So those elements may conspire against food security because of high vulnerability. And of course, as we'll see later on, impacts at the household level particularly tend to impact hardest on the poor because they spend a lot more higher shares of their incomes on food items, and hence the food impacts will be bigger. But we have to weigh all these factors in order to understand how the global trends impact on domestic price increases. If you go to the next slide. So here's some recent work that we have been doing together with my colleague David Laborde, and which provides you with a quick overview of the degrees and the different types of vulnerabilities that countries are exposed to. I just won't go over all the details here, but the first major conclusion is that we have to be very careful in differentiating the impacts on different countries. But what it shows here is that beyond the various types of exposures to either the conflict because of likely lower exports from Ukraine, Russia to certain food importing countries like Egypt, or direct exposure to export restrictions, and or that combined with low domestic stocks of grains are the ones that are immediately directly affected. I'd like to point at all the orange-colored countries on this map, which are basically the countries that are not that so much directly exposed to the impacts of the conflict in the Baltic Sea area, but rather because of the general food price increases and because of high share of food costs in consumption and in GDP and in import shares that are affecting these countries. And as you can see, these are a large number, probably the majority of the low and middle income countries. If we go to the next slide. And here you can see how that may impact these different degrees of vulnerability. And here's one of the couple of the most affected countries. Let me just focus here on one of them. The kind of vulnerabilities we see a country like Yemen, which imports about 82% of their calories, of which 22% from Russia and Ukraine. The total calorie consumption at risk, be it because of the trade ties or because of the exposure to export restriction directly, indirectly, is 44%. And the increase of just of the cost of wheat will increase the import bill of this country by almost 4% of GDP, which is an enormous impact for just a price shock for one single commodity. And that will come on top of already high domestic inflation. And what you cannot see well here, because a bit cut off here, but the food insecurity in Yemen, of course, are already very high, affecting about half of the population. We'll hear more about the Yemen situation later on. Go to the next slide, please. So here's what I said. So it's very clear the transmission effect and the impact on food security will also depend on on income levels and existing food insecurity situation, but this is just to underline the point already raised, is that lower income countries as well as lower income households are much more vulnerable simply because they spend much more of their income on food. Go to the next slide. Here's one of the lessons learned from the past food price crisis. I'll just highlight two elements here. One is that at that time, the estimate was that the impact of the 2010-11 crisis, accounting for all the shocks plus the insulation measures that countries did, which is, you can see from the left-hand side, that the world market price impacts did not fully translate, maybe just for half of it, into domestic price inflation. But ending up into an increase across the world, but mostly affecting Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, of about an increase in number of food insecure people of about 8 million people, is about 1%. So that's significant enough, but it's also not as major as some news reports would like it to see. And also in this, that the adverse effect of certain insulation mechanisms, particularly the trade mechanisms, account for about 40% of the increase in food insecurity. Hence, the conclusion here is trade policy as an insulation measure is not a good device. On to the next slide, please. So there's some recent estimates as well by FAO. We're still looking at it ourselves, but largely we see a range of, in terms of moderates and severe impact scenarios of possible increase from what we know now of the crisis, increased in a number of undernourished people around the world of between 8 and 13 million people, just by looking at the impacts on wheat and maize prices, which is fairly similar to the impacts that we saw with the 2010-2011 crisis. But maybe more importantly is that the main impact is indirectly on what I called before the category 6 countries, the orange colored countries in the vulnerability map, meaning that the story is not just about wheat and about the Ukraine, but the indirect effects it has on global markets and mediated through the other vulnerability factors onto food insecurity around the world. Well, to my next and last slide, and I'll conclude with that. So what does it mean for thinking about policy implication in the short run? Very clearly, we should avoid using trade policies to insulate the impacts of this crisis for consumers, be it through export restrictions or through reducing tariffs on foods. And likely, we should ideally also avoid sanctions hitting food and fertilizers. If politically that would seem difficult to do, then at least we should have compensating measures, particularly by facilitating access of food importers to alternative suppliers. That's also not a given. And also facilitate usage of the still pretty ample available food reserves for exports to the most vulnerable countries. So that will require quite a bit of international coordination. Then to insulate the poor, it's very important that we countries, particularly with have to foot very high import bills, get balance of payment support and fiscal support in order to avoid having to recur to trade restrictions and trade measures to insulate population, but rather do it through social protection measures and support for international food aid for those countries that are in dire need of more direct food assistance. And then lastly, and that brings me back to my initial point, we have to look beyond the current crisis. We have more and better monitoring mechanisms in place, not just to be prepared to give the right answers and tailored answers to the present crisis, but also the future crisis and other crises, as like what's happening now in the Horn of Africa, to be prepared. And we can only do that if we do that on a systematic basis, and that's what we're trying to work on and put in place at CGIAR and at IFPRI. So thank you very much, and apologies for taking more of my allotted time.
Thank you very much, Rob, for walking us through the different factors that determine a country's vulnerability to the high global prices. And we'll hear a lot of that later in the presentations on particular countries. And also thank you to you as well as Ali and Yo. All of you have stressed that, yes, this is a particular crisis, of course, but there are, we've already seen other crises, and crises are likely to continue and perhaps even become more frequent with climate change. So we need to be sure that we are monitoring the situation very closely all the time. I think that's a really important takeaway from your presentation. We're now moving to a country, and it's a very special country of Rwanda, and we're very honored to have with us the Honorable Minister of State in the Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Resources, Dr. Gabitsinze, who will speak to us about the situation in Rwanda. Let me point out that he has been in his position since March of 2020. Prior to that, he was a member of the parliament, and very importantly, I think also for this seminar, prior to that, he was a professor at the University of Rwanda. So he is certainly well-versed in academia and the importance of research. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank IFPRI for the invitation, but special thanks to opening remarks from Sweden, and we thank IFPRI even for the support they are giving us through the office we have here. Thank you to Dr. David with the team. We are happy to be here and to give you our history from last, let's say, 2 years, because from much as you have said, we have COVID. Can you please put in my presentation? Thank you so much. As I have said, 14 March 2020, the government of Rwanda issued the first measures against COVID. And from that day, the food prices have been increasing every day until to date, because of some reason you must know. First of all, because Rwanda is a landlocked country, the transportation costs became huge. And then the business in terms of volumes and value reduced because borders were closed. As we even trade in neighboring countries like Congo, we saw the reduction on volumes and values on trading because the border was closed for many months. So coming back to the presentation today, if you can go to the next one. Yeah, from the global commodity prices, if we take from the 2020 situation to February 2022, we can even add some days of March. We have had serious issues on edible oils. Edible oils because we import mainly 86% of our consumption is imported mainly from Ukraine and other countries. And today, after the war or the invasion of Russia, 33% of prices of edible oils increased just in 2-3 weeks. The same, we have issues on soybean. Soybean as a commodity is very important for us because it is used to produce animal feeds, mainly for poultry. As the production at local level is not too much to cover the imports, we're still importing huge quantities. And fertilizers is particular because we don't produce fertilizers in Rwanda. We import 100% of what we use in the agriculture sector. And here we have a big concern because without fertilizers, will not be able to increase productivity and to give substitution in terms of importation, visas, exportation. The gas, oil, mainly oil for transportation and energy, is affecting the food prices because, as I have said, as a country where we don't have a near ocean or a near transportation, it means in terms of reducing cost of transaction, we spend a lot of money for transportation from COVID until to now. And then the prices locally were not somehow high, but recently there is an increase of over 40% to all types of oil we are using. And this is a big concern for our country. If I can just take some minutes here, fertilizer and gas oil, because as you know, Rwanda as a small country, we use input and improve the seed to boost our productivity and to be able to reach the targets we have in our transformation program from 2018 to 2024. Recently, we don't have in terms of capacity of purchasing from our farmers because the prices have been increasing. But as you will see, the government put some subsidy. I will talk later on that. The same on gas and oil. Next. So inflation globally is becoming an issue, but locally in Rwanda is the same. Lastly, with the consumer price index we have had last month, we saw an increase from 3.2 to 4.2, then 4.2 to 5.6 as the global inflation. But if you go back on foods, as you can see, for example, on rice, soybean, wheat flour, rice, Asia, those are the commodities we are net importers. So even if you produce at local level, but the quantity is not enough, you can even add maize, meaning that the importation, because of the shocks I talked about, the importation prices are increasing. The cost of importation is increasing and are increasing the domestic prices. But there's another factor of this inflation is speculation. From the first day, 24 February, when Russia did the invasion to Ukraine, we have had serious issues among our traders because of speculation. They increased immediately 1 week after the price of rice, even domestic produced, the price of soybean, wheat it has been increased over 40% because wheat, even if it is not a commodity where all Rwandans are consuming every day, it's not a key commodity in terms of consumption, even in terms of business around, because we have an export of 27 million every year, and we import 70% of the grain used to produce flour or wheat are coming from Russia. Then we export it to RDC, Republic Democratic Congo. So I can say here, we are not concerned mainly of wheat, but we are concerned with other commodities like maize, like rice, like soybean, because those are key commodities consumed every day. And as I have said, because of the speculation, we have a slight increase on prices. But the trend we see, if you see, we have had high prices during 2020 when we began with COVID. But now, if you see the situation between December and now, it seems it's going to increase quickly if the war is not going to stop very soon, and we don't think it will be tomorrow after tomorrow. So we still have those problems connected to the inflation. But as you will see, we have some strategies we have been putting in place during the two years I have talked about, and we hope to continue to support our farmers even in terms of purchasing power, because the prices are increased, but the capacity of buying is reduced in terms of income generation. The next one. So as I have said, let's take time to talk about fertilizer. In our fourth strategy plan for agriculture transformation, as I have said, 2018-2024, we wanted to increase the use of fertilizer because is a factor of production where if we increase the volumes used, we see the increase in terms of productivity of our main key commodities. I can repeat again, is maize, beans, cassava, we have soybean, we have even wheat. So now we have, as I have said, we have a decrease in terms of use because of the cost of fertilizer from the last 2 years. But good enough, the government put in place a moderate subsidy, as you will see under strategies, and at least you can say our farmers have been producing during the COVID and this time of the war in Ukraine. There's no big variation in terms of production. then the cost of maintaining the progress to date is increasing dramatically, and we will see it will not be possible that the government continue to put money to subsidize if the price continue to increase. So we can ask ourselves if our progress to date be reversed by international events. If you go to the next, we can find the solutions we are proposing and how we can see which options we can apply to be able to deal with those external shocks. So first of all, in short-term solutions, we have to make sure that it has been said, restriction on trade you have to avoid in terms of the regional trade, because we trade mainly at regional level in East African community, in Africa in general. And as you know, the intra-trade in Africa is very weak. It's around 90% of the total trade we have. So meaning that we have to see how we can find new opportunities or open new windows to continue to trade and to be competitive. The second one, as I've said, is continue to provide subsidies. Okay, subsidies is a short-term solution because, as you know, we can't continue to subsidy until if the cost of commodities keep increasing. Is a dilemma to our government, but we hope we will be able to continue to cover a certain level to make sure that at least at the domestic level we keep producing the key commodities we need. Then we are trying to see how can we be able to have food substitution. Okay, now wheat is used mainly to produce bread and other products. So we have sweet potatoes here and cassava, and they can have a good flour to use as substitutions. We are trying this. We don't know how the market will respond. We have a small part of urban Kigali who are eating bread from sweet potatoes and cassava, but you don't know how the answer will be. But you want to make sure that we increase the production of sweet potatoes and cassava, then you can make substitution, because importation will only add on problems we have today in terms of purchasing power. Then you have had, even during COVID, a social protection system. First of all, economically, we have economic recovery fund. We give to small traders or business, even big, to make sure that they recover quickly. But there is another social aspect where we have been distributing food when was needed through our strategic reserve we have in our ministry. So we make sure that there is full with grains, beans, maize, flour. So we are ready. If needed, we continue to do it as we have done it during COVID. Then we have to see how we can open us to find source of supply. Here I want to mean that we want to make sure that if we can't afford, today we are buying fertilizers mainly from Russia, then we see it's not possible. We are trying to contact Morocco because we think they can be a good substitute. Then we see Saudi Arabia to make sure we are doing the good deal. Of course, international prices will be increased globally, but make sure that we find where you can buy at less cost, and the transportation will be easy for us. Then strategically, you have to make sure that even if we intervene, now we are intervening to the market to make sure that we correct irregularities we can find, like speculation. But we can't force the market. We want the market to work itself. We want to see business continue. So as government, we make sure that we facilitate, but we don't want to impose what can happen to the market. Medium to long term solutions. Of course, as a country where I have said you have a limited land, we have to find a way to boost productivity. To boost productivity today is through using improved seeds, is through using technology. So we want to make sure that we increase production, and as I've said, we open market. Then you have to make sure that we are prepared with future shocks through data, through having policy in terms to respond quickly, dynamic policies. Then you make sure that our trade integration, as I have said, is more open than it has been in the last years. So I thank you so much, and is a chance again to be here as Rwanda to present. Thank you again, and we will continue to enjoy our collaboration with IFPRI. And again, we thank the office you gave us here in Rwanda, because we're working seriously on economic modeling to inform our policymakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister. You put on one of your slides, there's a need to take some tough strategic decisions. And boy, have you outlined that extremely well. If fertilizer subsidies are already accounting for 12% of your budget, and then you think about all the other needs that you have, that is indeed a challenging situation. So thank you very much for outlining that for us. We will soon be moving to our Q&A session after the next set of speakers. So let me remind you again, please do submit your brief questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. We're now moving to a set of rapid fire presentations. These are rather short presentations to give you, again, a sense of what is happening in particular countries or regions. And I'm delighted to kick us off with Yemen. We've already heard some about the very challenging situation in Yemen. And now it's my pleasure to turn over to Sikandar Kurdi, who's a research fellow at IFPRI, to give us a little bit more of a deeper look at the challenges facing Yemen, of course, long-standing challenges, but now greatly exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss a little bit today about the situation for food security in Yemen as a result of the current sharp increase in wheat prices. My remarks today will draw on work authored jointly with Clemens Breisinger, Joseph Glauber, and David Laborde. So an important piece of the background for Yemen, can go to the next slide, as Rob highlighted earlier today, is that the country relies extremely heavily on wheat imports for feeding its population. Yemen historically was self-sufficient in agriculture and has a very kind of developed traditional system of terraces and spate irrigation. But since the 1970s, local grain production has fallen as population has increased, and the country has become increasingly reliant on remittances and overexploitation of groundwater resources, and dependent for food supplies on imports of wheat and grains in general. With the civil war, which started in 2015, it's been very destructive for the Yemeni economy. You can see that total exports fell dramatically while imports rose. Today, food imports alone exceed total exports from Yemen. And Yemen's basically dependent still on remittances and international aid. So this creates a very significant vulnerability to rising prices on world markets, especially vulnerable to the supply shock from Russia and Ukraine. 46% of calories in Yemen food supply are from wheat. It's very much the central staple food item in people's diets. And you can see in the figure here, a substantial share of that is coming directly from Ukraine and Russia in the orange. And then additionally from other MENA countries, which are in turn kind of re-exporting from Ukraine and Russia. Additionally, in terms of the vulnerability to the fuel price shock, Yemen produces a modest amount of crude oil, but it relies on imports of diesel and gasoline because it doesn't have its own refinery. And there's been a lot of government intervention in the fuel market. As a result, prices are high, and from the side of consumers, if they want to access fuel, it's basically impossible. There's very dramatic shortages, people in very long lines to get any form of fuel. Next slide, please. On the side of food and wheat, food markets generally are fairly free and functional. Unlike fuel, there's not a lot of direct government intervention. That also means that the global wheat prices are transferred pretty directly to the local retail markets. So the challenge for Yemeni households is definitely affordability. The bulk of calories for poor households comes from staple grains, about 71%. And for poor households, they're spending like 25% of their budget on wheat alone. Notably also, as people's budgets become more constrained, what we've seen historically over the course of the conflict is that the response of Yemeni households is to cut out more high-priced food items and rely even more heavily on the cheapest calorie sources, particularly imported wheat. So even with the increase in prices, there's still very strong demand. And the alternative of ramping up local production is unlikely to make much difference in the short term. First of all, you have the high fuel prices that make kind of the irrigation prohibitively expensive because they're not able to power the diesel pumps, and also for transportation. And then you just have also the history since the 1970s where the infrastructure in agriculture there is not at all oriented towards cereal production. Food security since the civil war is extremely high. All areas of the country are classified as crisis or emergency, with the potential for famine to emerge if current trends continue. Next slide, please. This kind of slides into my next topic here, which is that the really significant role of a humanitarian response in terms of the wheat supply in Yemen. So more than half of Yemeni households receive some form of food aid, and it actually accounts for 12% of cereal imports to Yemen. Humanitarian aid primarily from the World Food Programme and also others. And the World Food Programme alone is reaching about 43% of Yemen's population. So there's two challenges for the humanitarian response with the current war. First, the food aid distributed in Yemen often includes processed products that are sourced from other MENA countries, in turn from wheat from Ukraine and Russia. So you can see this in the diagram here. And then there's also uncertainty about sufficient international funding for maintaining the current level of support that the Yemeni people are relying on to avoid famine. At the recent high-level pledging event this month, donors committed approximately 30% less than in 2021, in spite of the increased prices, which are going to increase the cost of providing the same amount of food aid. Next slide, please. So looking toward the future, one potential response is to continue the trend towards a greater use of cash rather than in-kind transfers. In cash in general, and especially in Yemen, we've seen is more cost efficient than in-kind food distribution and allow households to increase the consumption of non-staple food items as well. One of the challenges for that approach would be maintaining the value of cash transfers in the face of high inflation, not only as a result of the global wheat prices, but also because of devaluation of the currency in the areas controlled by the internationally recognized government in the south. And then in the longer term, this is the importance of the humanitarian development nexus approach, is that it's not sufficient just to focus on the short term, which in Yemen has already been almost 7 years of what's in theory a short-term crisis where you're providing food aid directly to people, but also to long-term development goals such as supporting local agricultural production, recovering that tradition in Yemen. Especially this is where, as Ali had discussed in his presentation, agricultural research from One CGIAR system, other partners can be helpful to promote practices that are more resilient to the conflict situation and to potential shocks in global prices and fuel supply in particular. So thinking about practices such as drip irrigation, the renovation of the traditional terrace systems, and the use of solar power. But then finally, ultimately, the only way for Yemen to recover, to be really on a safe path again, is to have a political situation to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sikandar, also for highlighting the humanitarian aid angle, because of course we have a huge refugee crisis now in Europe, but there are many other humanitarian needs around the world. So we're running a little bit out of time, so I would like to ask the next three presenters if they could to keep their remarks very short. I know it's a big challenge, but we have questions coming in, and I definitely want to give some time to Q&A. So our next speaker is Valeria Pinheiro, who's a research coordinator at IFPRI, and she has the, the big job of talking about the entire region of Latin America and Caribbean in just a few minutes. Over to you, Valeria.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And yes, indeed, my presentation will be a little bit different just because I will try to cover the whole region. And as we all know, next slide, please, Katarla. As we all know, the region is very heterogeneous. So the impact of this conflict will really depend on how each country dealt with COVID-19 in terms of lockdowns, stimulus packages, and so forth, but also its recovery. And also if they are net food importer versus net food exporters, as well as energy sources, all these will have a different impact. So for example, looking at this slide, Argentina and Brazil, which have a large food trade surplus, will experience different impacts than the Caribbean, El Salvador, and Panama, which all have food trade deficits. The figure on the right shows a clustering of countries by major export commodity basket. We can also see that the Mercosur countries, that they are all the dark purple, are major exporters of soy, cereals, and animal protein. The same commodities actually that they are exported by Russia and Ukraine, while Chile, Ecuador, and Peru primarily export fruits and fishery exports. It is also relevant that Russia only accounts for 1.5% of total exports from the region. The exports of soybeans, bananas, frozen beef, and fish by Ecuador, Colombia, and Paraguay are the ones, and Nicaragua imports wheat from Russia. So Latin America and the Caribbean will not be directly affected by the agri-food trade restrictions that arrive with this conflict, but it will be affected by the same channels already mentioned by the other panelists. I just wanted to highlight one thing about fertilizers. Brazil imports 85% of its potassium-based fertilizers from the region, and Peru, Ecuador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, and Suriname, given their high dependence on nitrogen fertilizer imports from Russia and Belarus. Next slide. This figure zooms into the one Rob showed earlier based on the vulnerability index done by David Laborde that shows how vulnerable each country is at the time of facing this crisis. So the green color, which is Brazil, represents a moderate impact, no immediate risk, but fertilizer supply is seriously compromised, as I mentioned earlier. In yellow, high vulnerability due to food consumption exposed to conflicts by Nicaragua and Venezuela. Their situation, of course, is not new, but it can be exacerbated. The blue that only represents Panama is a high risk of food price increase due to last month changes. And then in light blue or turquoise is high vulnerability due to large increase in the food cost compared to GDP is expected, and that represents almost all the rest of Latin America. Next slide, please. This slide showed just 3 of the indicators that are part of the vulnerability index showed in the previous slide. Others included the amount of calories consumed by each country that comes from Russia and or Ukraine, or the amount of calories that will be affected by export restrictions. Either of them were relevant for Latin America and the Caribbean for the reasons that I already mentioned. However, food inflation, that's the figure on the left, highlights high inflation in Venezuela and Argentina. Both of them come from even previous to the conflict, and they are related with macro and political reasons. But Argentina using export restrictions as a very inefficient way to curb inflation. And then the figures in the middle shows the 12-month variation of the current account as percentage of GDP for all goods, and the one on the right, it's only for food. A lighter color means an improvement in the current account. And I just want to highlight the increase in imports on all goods in Panama and the benefit of Mercosur countries when related to food. all this will relate to import capacity for these countries. We will have a blog this week that will analyze these vulnerabilities and the conflict in Latin America. And the next slide. So I just want to highlight some of the things that I think that are important for Latin America, just not be very repetitive. So I would just like to say that in the short term, for Latin America, we do have to resolve the problem of fertilizer. Otherwise, the food supply will be impacted for next year. And that will be related also with land expansion, so that we will have to be very careful how we play that one. Then Argentina's export restrictions and price control policies, again, not new, but they are increasing in complexity and impact. And then the financial flows and interest rates that impact the already troubled fiscal deficits in the region and their capacity to have the safety nets, the proper safety nets to deal with these increases in the food prices in countries. Then in the longer term, there are two things I would like to highlight. The first one is that this may open up export opportunities, mainly for countries that export milling products, grains, fats and oils, and oilseeds. This is especially interesting for the case of Mercosur countries, but also, for example, Colombia as a palm oil producer. And the second one is the diversification of suppliers and demand side becomes even more relevant. For example, Mercosur countries should think of strategies for not relying on the Chinese market for their exports of soybeans. We will still have some uncertainties, so we still have to see what China will do by less amount of wheat related with stocks, buy from Russia at discounted prices that could create an opportunity for other countries to access production from Canada that currently is China's supplier. Then the second one is the Spanish government announced a temporary relaxation of the phytosanitary rules to import corn for animal feed from Argentina and Brazil. This could create a risk in this situation, makes a kind of bypass to the European Union Mercosur agreement and the irreversibility of the environmental damages that this could create. For example, in Brazil, there is federal legislatures are trying to push to open protected indigenous lands for the mining of potash. And then the third one is the impact on energy transition. Will we be impacted? How much? What's going to be that rate? And what about biofuels? So Charlotte already mentioned some of that, and I won't go into this for short time, but that is something else that we need to look into. So just to conclude, the current crisis has highlighted the importance of diversification in dealing with increased level of risk seen in the current world. The US-China trade tensions, the COVID-19, increasing natural disasters and conflict creates problems in logistics, and others impacted the accessibility and affordability of inputs and food products, which is translated in more volatility in the markets and the implementation of domestic policies that reinforces higher world prices. In particular, governments have to keep working on interventions that take care of the most vulnerable, like the safety nets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valeria. Great overview of what's happening in the region as a result of the developments in Ukraine. Next up is Myanmar, and we're very delighted to have with us Bart Minton, a senior research fellow also at IFPRI and the leader of the Myanmar Strategy Support Program at IFPRI. Bart, thank you for walking us through, again, the very delicate situation that Myanmar is facing.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. I'll give a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Myanmar. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Myanmar is one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. It has been really hard hit over the last year by two crises. First, the COVID-19 crisis, like a lot of countries, but in the case of Myanmar, because of the closure of borders by China, this was a big hit for them. The second one is political turmoil over the last year and creating all kind of insecurity issues in the country, and was a big hit to the economy. And it has been estimated by the World Bank, for example, that the Myanmar's economy contracted by almost 20% last year. There are about 14 million people in humanitarian need out of 55 million currently. And so let's then look what's happening now with the food system linked in recent months. First, we have to highlight the role of rice is the main staple in the country, represent about 60% of the calories of the people and about half of the cropland in the monsoon season. The most important agricultural season is allocated to rice. It's in a normal situation is also a rice exporting country. Next slide. So what do we see happening with these rice prices in the country? Internationally, as you indicated already, we have not too many problems with the stocks of rice. And so compared to a year ago, the price of rice internationally is actually down. So if you look at the price of Thai rice, it was 90% lower in February than last year, but it has been increasing in more recent months. Now, international prices are down. That doesn't mean that local prices are down. So if you look at the graph on the right side, you see what's happening with retail prices in Myanmar and with farm gate prices. Retail prices are in green, farm gate prices are in red. Retail prices at the national level, they have been increasing over the last year by 15%. We see especially big increases in those areas that are affected by conflict, about 20% increases there. Now, if you look at the red bar, the increases for the farm gate prices, we see that these price rises are much smaller. They are about 5%. And so indicating that these differences between the retail markets and the farm gate prices are becoming bigger, driven by insecurity, driven by increased transportation costs, and driven by banking systems, banking problems in the country. Next slide. Then just one slide on what's happening with fertilizer. Very big deal in Myanmar. Is the biggest commercial input for farms in the country. 2 years ago, they were importing for about $400 million US. The prices for fertilizer in nominal terms is now about 3 times higher than 2 years ago. But these prices have been going up in a big way, but the farm prices have not changed. So that will lead to less use of fertilizer in the agricultural sector. And so we will see a contraction of the rice in the agricultural sector. And so we have done some simulations to try to see what the impact would be. And so if we would have a reduction of fertilizer use in the agricultural sector by to have the level, that would lead to a reduction of output by between 9 and 12%. So the really dire situation in Myanmar, it's consumers are faced with higher retail prices and farmers are being squeezed with farm gate prices that do not change and then input prices that are going up in a big way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bart, for highlighting all of the issues facing Myanmar. Our last presentation is on Ethiopia, again, a rather challenging situation in that country. And we're very happy to have with us Zerem Gachave-Kalbora, who's an economist at the World Bank. Thank you very much for joining us, Zerem.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak on this event. So I will be very quick on with the best interest of time as well. And already, as the previous speakers has indicated, the global prices are increasing, and this has been happening since the pandemic. And the recent price increases are building on the impacts of the pandemic, and in particular for Ethiopia as a net importer of food, mainly wheat and cooking oil, fuel, fertilizers, and the increasing commodity price means that then there will have impacts on direct and indirect impacts on food security in Ethiopia. So in addition to adding to the already dire inflationary pressure, the recent rise in global commodity prices might impact the agricultural production and productivity, as fertilizer prices have soared, and we are hearing that fertilizer prices have already doubled. Prior to the current crisis, domestic prices have been rising due to local factors, including the pandemic and also a recent conflict which is happening in the northern part of Ethiopia. And that has disrupted agricultural production and trade and value chains. Inflation is mainly driven by food inflation, basically bread and cereals, cooking oil, contributing about 60% to the food inflation. And for the last 6 months, inflation has been running above 30%. And then the Ukraine-Russia crisis is adding further to the inflationary pressure. Next slide. And when we see the local prices, cereal prices are on the rise, and wheat and maize prices have been increasing over the recent months, and this is happening during the harvest season as well. As the lean season is approaching, and then given the Ukraine-Russia crisis, then prices will continue to trend up in the coming months as well. And Ethiopia is importing wheat from that region, from Ukraine or Russia. And the increase in prices means that the wheat import bill will increase, which will have an impact on the balance of payment of the country as well. So quickly going to the outlook. So the increase in fertilizer price may have an increase in productivity, may impact agricultural production, as farmers may not be applying fertilizer as they used to in previous years or in previous seasons. And rising wheat prices may increase food insecurity in urban areas. And government has been importing wheat to subsidize urban bread prices. And given the increase in prices, the import bill obviously will increase, and then the volume of import may probably decrease. And significant risk of reversing development might be happening, and more people may be falling back to poverty again, and poverty reduction gains might be reversing. So in the short run, what could be done is that increasing the coverage of social protection to safeguard the welfare of the urban poor and both the rural poor. And Ethiopia has a well-functioning social protection program in both in urban and rural areas, and then strengthening that and increasing the coverage of that social protection, provided the fiscal space allows, and then provided also the donor support is available, that would safeguard the welfare of the urban and rural poor, or the vulnerable section of the society during this increasing prices. And in the long run, enhancing productivity to reduce exposure to international commodity price and volatility might be important. And increasing productivity or domestic productivity would be important to safeguard or to be resilient for both the shocks from the international commodity price markets, and also from the shocks due to the climate change, which is also impacting agricultural production in developing countries, including Ethiopia. Thank you so much. That's all from my side. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarion. Very good presentation. So let's move straight into the Q&A session. Understandably, we've had a number of questions asking in the short term, what are the opportunities for other producers to step in for providing the exports that Ukraine and Russia are no longer or may no longer be able to provide? So a question from Louise Sarand, are other countries in Europe or on the American continent able to produce sufficient quantities of wheat to plug the import gap for countries like Egypt, Lebanon, and others? Another questioner asks a similar question, scope for alternative sources to make up for Ukraine, Russia's supplies. So I'd like to turn to Rob on that question, and also maybe we can have Valeria jump in, because Mercosur, of course, is such an important provider of staples. And then if Ali maybe would like to speak to that question as well, but more from the perspective of how can we ramp up more local production of food to make up for that shortfall, or simply to combat the high prices that we're facing. And then lastly, if Bart would like to come in, China is a special case here as well for two reasons. China, we understand, has pretty sizable food reserves, strategic reserves. Is there any opportunity maybe for China to provide some support to countries like Myanmar? And secondly, China is also a very important producer of fertilizers, but they have imposed export restrictions. What do you anticipate maybe on that front as well, Bart? So let's start with Rob and then move to Valeria, Ali, and Bart.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. In the short run, there are limited options. There are few, but particularly if we take the nature of particularly wheat production in Ukraine and Russia, it's winter wheat, so it's planted in the fall and harvested in the summer. So there's little to replace that exactly. So it could be replaced with some more production that might happen of countries that have space to produce what we call soft wheat, which is or summer wheat, which is particularly planted in the spring and then harvested later this year. Now, that said, so that won't be an immediate response to potential shortages that may emerge now. So the real response, if we want to have mitigation effects in the short run, it will have to come from reserves. Some countries are already trying. I mentioned the case of India, which is beefing up its exports of wheat. It's not a major producer, but big enough, and it has big enough reserves to do something, but that will only be a partial solution to it. You mentioned yourself, China has huge reserves, but they're holding that also for their own sake. It would need quite a bit of international persuasion for China to step in and use those reserves. So we still have a bit of time to buy. So probably total amount of reserves around the world, excluding China, is about 60 days. So that really depends on how things are playing out in the coming weeks or months, whether we really will see that exports from the Baltic Sea region will come to a complete halt, as well as that harvest may be lost, and then these short-term measures may mitigate a little bit, but won't be enough to avoid a much steeper rise in prices. So overall, the scope for replacement is not that easy. Of course, substitution is possible, but that will require quite a bit of bigger adjustment along supply chains, whether people are willing to buy bread from cassava or other substitutes. That will be then a question, but all that will take some adjustment time. So the immediate short-term problems won't be resolved that way.
Thanks, Rob. Valeria, if you want to add anything.
I would just add two more things to what Rob said. Indeed, if you're talking about South America, so as you said, Argentina and the Mercosur countries, but more than anything, Argentina with respect of wheat. What it is done from this campaign is it's done. So in the short term, there is not much to do. In terms of exports already, they are compromised, most of it as well. So what we need to think about is what next. So for the next campaign, what's going to to happen in these countries. And so Argentina, it's a very interesting case because they also have a lot of domestic policies that affect the agricultural sector. And these also policies kind of, in my perspective, they don't really act all together to really motivate and give incentives and the right signals at the proper timing to do. So it will really be key of what the government does in the next coming months. And depending on how the conflict evolve, they will also take their own measures at home. So I think that will be a very key issue. The other thing is, of course, that the fertilizer, and that for me plays a bigger impact in Brazil, because Brazil uses more fertilizer than Argentina and the US for producing more than anything soy, but the other as well. And they also import 95% of their fertilizers. So that will be key for this season, but also for the future one. And then the third thing is China. And I would just say one thing, even though I know you asked to the next panelist, but I think that I said it in my presentation. China will be, whatever China does in the upcoming weeks and months will be very important. And there are two things important. The first one is, yes, they do have stocks. We're not very sure exactly what's the quantity, but more than anything, the quality of the stocks that they already have. They're also predicting that this harvest is not going to be a very good one for China. So those are two things that won't play in our favor, kind of thing. But then the third one is what they are going to do in terms of buying wheat from Russia. They already said that they will buy some from Russia. So how much will they buy from Russia? And that will leave some open space or extra production, more than anything from Canada. That's where they import more of wheat from, that maybe Canadians can sell to other countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Those are great points. Ali, you've highlighted some of the innovations that we need to put into place in order to increase domestic production in countries, and many of them being put forward by the CGIAR. Do you see any of that sort of playing a role in the short run, or are we talking more medium to longer term results that we expect there?
Yeah, I think, it's more about the medium to long term. The immediate one will be around options for mixing alternative crops to wheat to be able to make bread, like in the case of barley. But even barley is largely affected because, Ukraine and Russia also are major producers of barley, although most of it goes to brewing. But let me just highlight one other issue for the Middle East and North Africa, because you have, it's not just the issue of supply, it's the issue of ability to buy. And I think under the rising food prices, these countries, at least 8 out of the 16, suffer from very significant economic challenges that makes even the availability of foreign currency to purchase, even if the supply was available, is a major challenge. So with the doubling of the prices, it's even much more complex. So it is only natural to look for, as much as possible, local solutions to the extent possible to complement the needs of the people in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Bart, do you want to come in briefly on Myanmar and possibility of working more exports coming from China?
Yeah, just maybe something I could add. I don't see China stepping in a big way to help other countries. Maybe some selected countries that they are really very friendly with, they might help, but I don't see them stepping in Myanmar. One thing that I haven't heard mentioning is the issue with COVID in China, right? So they still are blocking a lot of their borders. So it's very hard to export anything into China or things coming from China into Myanmar, for example. This border has been closed for the last 6 months, 9 months. And so they open it for a week and then they close it again for a long period. So how they're going to deal with COVID will determine a lot of these things in these agricultural markets in these neighboring countries.
Thanks, Bart. And of course, that's a point, I think, across the world, right? We're in this new crisis, but the old crisis is still with us. COVID is not yet in the rearview mirror, and supply chains are still backed up because of some of the COVID-related issues that have happened over the past few years. So I'm really sorry that we have run out of time. We've got a lot of questions, and obviously there's a lot of interest here. And I just can thank all of you speakers for really laying out, I think, the complexity of the situation, the many different angles that we need to be looking at the situation, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And fertilizers has come up a number of times, so let me make a plug for the next seminar in this series, which will happen May 4th. Sorry, is it April or May 4th now? Anyway, we'll update you on that, but there will be a seminar squarely focused on fertilizer prices coming up under this series, so please keep an eye out for that. Thank you again to all the speakers, to the IFPRI event management team, and wishing all of you a wonderful rest of your day or evening, wherever you may be. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.